My sister took credit for the business I built. The investors asked one unexpected question. My sister was halfway through explaining how she had built my company from a folding table in our mother's laundry room when the lead investor closed his notebook and asked her one question. He did not ask about revenue, valuation, or the $12 million his firm was considering investing. He asked what would happen if someone activated the June Protocol. Camille stopped smiling. 300 people were watching her from the ballroom of the Halcyon Hotel. Behind her, a 40-foot screen displayed a photograph of that old folding table, carefully cropped so I was no longer visible. I stood near the service doors wearing a temporary badge that identified me as operations support. 2 hours earlier, my access to the presentation had been removed. 2 days earlier, my name had disappeared from the company website. For 6 years, I had written the software, recruited the first employees, signed every early customer, and slept beside a humming server rack because we could not afford proper hosting. Yet Camille had just introduced herself as the sole founder of Threadline. The June Protocol was not mentioned in our sales material. It did not appear in the investor deck. Only 4 people knew its full purpose, and Camille was not one of them. That was the moment I understood the investors had not come to the ballroom merely to hear a pitch. They had come to find out which sister was lying. 6 years earlier, Threadline had not been a company. It had been a problem I could not stop thinking about. I was 28, working as a process engineer for a regional food distributor, and spending my days watching small manufacturers lose money for reasons nobody could see. A shipment would arrive late because one purchasing system used local time, while another used coordinated time. A bakery would discard thousands of dollars of ingredients because its inventory software counted cases, while the supplier counted individual units. A family factory would discover that a single duplicated invoice had been paid 4 times because accounting, shipping, and procurement each believed another department had verified it. Large corporations solved those problems by buying expensive systems and hiring consultants to force everything into one structure. Small businesses lived with spreadsheets, text messages, and people who carried entire operations in their memories. When those people became sick, retired, or simply missed one detail, the business stumbled. My mother owned a small packaging company called Bennett Carton. She had built it with my father before he died, and she kept it alive through 2 recessions with equal parts stubbornness and unpaid overtime. One winter, a supplier changed its invoice format. The change was small enough that nobody noticed, and large enough that our accounting program read the freight charge as part of the unit price. For 11 weeks, Mom overpaid every shipment. By the time I found the pattern, she was close to missing payroll. I spent 3 nights writing a crude reconciliation tool that compared purchase orders, delivery records, invoices, and actual stock movement. It was ugly, slow, and held together by more exceptions than rules, but it found every mismatch. We recovered enough money to make payroll. Then it caught a fraudulent invoice from a contractor who had been billing Mom for maintenance visits that never happened. The owner of the bakery next door heard about it and asked whether I could adapt it for him. A machine shop asked the following month. Then a cold storage operator called because his daughter knew the bakery owner's son. I began working nights and weekends, replacing the crude script with a real platform that could translate information between systems without forcing small companies to rebuild their entire operations. I named it Threadline because it followed the thread of a transaction from the moment someone requested an item to the moment money left the bank. Every purchase had a story. The software's job was to make sure the story remained consistent. Camille lived in Chicago then. She was 4 years older, naturally charming, and very good at making every room feel as if it had been waiting for her. Our parents had always understood us through an easy division. Camille was the ambitious one. I was the dependable one. She gave speeches at school events. I stayed afterward to stack chairs. She announced plans. I quietly repaired them. Nobody meant the distinction as an insult, but over time it became permission for Camille to be seen and an obligation for me to be useful. When I told my family I was leaving my job to build Threadline full-time, Mom worried that I was sacrificing a stable career for a complicated spreadsheet. Camille called the idea clever but small. She advised me to sell it to a real software company before someone else built a better version. I ignored both of them. I had 9 months of savings, 3 paying customers, and the unreasonable certainty that I understood a problem other people had overlooked. The first year nearly broke me. I worked from Mom's laundry room because it was the only part of her building with reliable cooling. The folding table in Camille's presentation really had been there, but the photograph originally showed me sitting beneath a pipe with 2 monitors balanced on old shipping catalogs. I handled support calls, wrote code, negotiated contracts, and drove to customer sites carrying a toolbox because half the failures blamed on my software were actually loose network cables. My first employee was Ravi Shah, a patient developer who accepted half his market salary and a small equity grant because he believed translation between messy systems was a harder and more valuable problem than people realized. My second was Tessa Morgan, an implementation specialist who had managed inventory for a hospital network. Together, we built connectors, documented exceptions, and learned that software earned trust differently in small companies. Owners did not care about elegant architecture if the delivery truck was waiting and payroll closed at 5. The June protocol grew out of that lesson. June was my grandmother, the woman who had taught my mother how to keep Bennett Carton alive. She used to say that no machine should be allowed to make a mistake faster than a person could stop it. When Threadline detected conflicting instructions that could trigger an irreversible action, sending a large payment, releasing regulated inventory, or deleting a confirmed order, it froze the action and created a sealed record of every input. The system then required approval from 2 people who held different roles. If someone tried to bypass the freeze, Threadline preserved the attempted override in a separate ledger that even an administrator could not erase. It was not a glamorous feature. It slowed demonstrations and made some prospects complain about friction, but it once stopped a medical supplier from shipping temperature-sensitive medicine to an outdated address, and it once prevented an employee at Bennett Carton from redirecting a 6-figure vendor payment to a fraudulent account. I refused to remove it. By the end of the second year, we had 27 customers and more work than 3 people could handle. I needed someone who could sell the product while I built an implementation team. Camille had recently left a luxury retail company after a reorganization. She offered to help for 6 months. I hesitated because working with family felt dangerous, but I was exhausted and she was convincing. Camille could take the technical truth of Threadline and make it sound inevitable. She understood how to enter a room, identify who held power, and speak directly to that person's fear. Within 8 weeks, she had secured meetings I had chased for a year. Within 6 months, our annual recurring revenue had tripled. I offered her a permanent role as Chief Commercial Officer, a generous salary, and 12% of the company vesting over 4 years. Camille asked to use the title co-founder because customers responded better to it. I told her the history mattered and proposed founding team instead. She said the distinction felt petty. Mom told me not to let a word damage a partnership that was obviously working. I gave in on the public title while keeping the legal records accurate. It was the first time I allowed peace to cost me a piece of the truth. At first, the compromise seemed harmless. Camille brought confidence to investor meetings, and I brought answers. She would describe the market. I would explain why our architecture could survive it. She would promise a future. I would turn the promise into a roadmap. Reporters preferred quoting her because she spoke in clean, dramatic sentences. I did not mind. I wanted Threadline to succeed more than I wanted strangers to recognize me. The danger arrived gradually. An article referred to Camille as the visionary behind Threadline and called me her younger sister, who led technical operations. Camille promised to request a correction, but the correction never appeared. A conference organizer placed her on a founders panel and offered me a workshop on back-office systems. She said accepting both would give the company more exposure. At our annual dinner, she told the story of recognizing the invoice problem at Bennett Carton while I built the first prototype for her. I corrected her privately. She said she had simplified the story for an audience. Every simplification made her larger and me smaller. Our employees knew the truth, but new hires learned the company through Camille's version. She began approving public materials without sending them to me. The laundry room photograph appeared with a caption describing her first headquarters. A designer removed a whiteboard from the image because my handwriting covered it. Then someone cropped me out to make the composition cleaner. I should have confronted the pattern earlier. Instead, I kept believing evidence would protect me. My name was on the Articles of Incorporation. I owned 62% of the common shares. The original code repository began with thousands of commits under my account. Every patent filing listed me and Ravi as inventors. Camille could decorate the story, but she could not change the structure beneath it. I underestimated how much damage a person can do before legal truth is asked to speak. Threadline entered its 6th year with 180 employees, 214 customers, and a problem created by its own growth. Larger clients wanted international support, stronger security certifications, and integrations that would take years to finance from revenue alone. Camille pushed for a Series B investment. I agreed that we needed capital, but I wanted a firm that understood operational risk. She wanted the highest valuation and the largest announcement. We hired Beacon Row Partners to advise us. Camille took control of the fundraising process and told me I would be more valuable keeping product delivery on schedule. That division made sense until meetings began appearing on my calendar after they had happened. When I asked for the data room, she said the finance team was cleaning it. When I requested access again, our new chief financial officer, Martin Vale, told me Camille had limited the group to avoid version conflicts. Martin had joined 3 months earlier at Camille's recommendation. He had polished credentials, expensive glasses, and the habit of answering a simple question with enough detail to conceal that he had not answered it. I had opposed granting him immediate authority over banking and equity records. Camille said my caution was making senior hires feel distrusted. Then forecasts began changing. The board packet showed committed revenue from contracts I knew were still under negotiation. Implementation costs were moved into a category that made our gross margin look higher. Customer cancellations appeared as transitions to a new tier, even when no new agreement existed. Each individual choice could be defended as optimistic accounting. Together, they created a company that looked healthier and faster growing than the one I ran every day. I sent written objections to Camille and Martin and copied our outside counsel. Camille called me within 5 minutes. She said investors expected ambition, not an engineer's anxiety. She accused me of treating every forecast like a safety protocol. I answered that forecasts could be ambitious without being false. The following morning, I discovered that a special board meeting had been scheduled to revise executive responsibilities. Camille framed it as temporary fundraising governance. She proposed becoming chief executive with sole authority over financing and public communications, while I became chief product officer. The title sounded senior, but the accompanying resolution removed my control over hiring, budgets, contracts, and the data room. 2 independent directors supported her because she had told them I was overwhelmed and considering medical leave. Mom, who still held a small board observer role, urged me not to embarrass the family by fighting in front of outsiders. I rejected the medical leave claim and asked that my objection be entered into the minutes. The resolution passed anyway. Ownership protected certain decisions, but years earlier I had agreed to a board structure designed to reassure institutional investors. I still controlled my shares. I no longer controlled the room. Camille used the new authority immediately. My administrator privileges were reduced. The communications team received instructions to route all founder references through her office. Ravi was told not to speak with investors without Martin present. Tessa's access to customer retention data disappeared. Camille described each restriction as ordinary diligent security. 3 weeks before the Halcyon presentation, an employee forwarded me a draft investor deck. Its opening slide read, Camille Bennett, founder and CEO. A timeline showed her conceiving Threadline in 2020 and hiring me the following year to lead product development. The photograph from the laundry room filled an entire page. My name appeared once, in an organizational chart under Camille. I walked into her office with the printed deck. Camille did not deny approving it. She said investors preferred a clean founder narrative, and 2 sisters with overlapping claims looked unstable. I reminded her that the clean narrative was a lie. She answered that I had built a product while she had built a company. That sentence clarified everything. Camille did not think she was stealing. She thought visibility had converted contribution into ownership. I demanded that the deck be corrected before it went to investors. She promised to consider language that honored my role without confusing the market. That afternoon, security notified me that my data room access had been suspended due to a possible credential issue. The next day, my assistant was reassigned. On Friday, the company website changed. I contacted our outside counsel, but the partner who usually handled corporate matters said Martin had instructed the firm that only Camille could authorize work related to financing. He carefully reminded me that he represented Threadline, not either sister individually. The warning was useful. I retained my own attorney, Naomi Price, that evening. Naomi did not comfort me. She built a timeline. We collected incorporation documents, stock ledgers, intellectual property assignments, board consents, emails, repository history, customer contracts, and every version of the fundraising materials I could legally access. The legal foundation was stronger than I feared. The operational situation was worse. The cap table in the investor data room was not the approved cap table. My 62% ownership had been reduced to 31 through a proposed recapitalization displayed as if it had already occurred. A pool of unissued shares had been labeled Management Incentive Equity and allocated largely to Camille and Martin. The document carried an electronic version of my signature. I had never seen it. Naomi arranged for a forensic specialist to examine the signature record. It had been created from a PDF I signed 18 months earlier for an insurance renewal. Someone had copied the image, placed it on the recapitalization consent, and generated a completion certificate through an administrative account. The certificate listed my old company email address, even though the supposed signing occurred after my access had been restricted. That was no longer a branding dispute, it was attempted theft. Naomi advised me not to confront Camille until we understood who had received the false documents. If the investors relied on them and transferred money, the damage would multiply. We sent preservation notices to the company, outside counsel, and Beacon Row. We also notified the chair of the board's audit committee. The chair, Daniel Cho, responded within an hour and asked for a private meeting. Daniel had not seen the recapitalization consent. The version in his board portal showed the transaction as pending founder approval. He also had not been told I objected to the revenue classifications. When I showed him my emails, he became quiet in the particular way experienced directors become quiet when they realize a disagreement may actually be evidence. He did not promise to take my side. He promised an independent review. Camille learned about the preservation notices the next morning. She called an emergency executive meeting and accused me of sabotaging the financing. In front of 12 people, she announced that I had become emotionally attached to an outdated version of the company and could no longer distinguish personal recognition from corporate interest. I watched several colleagues study the table because they were afraid of revealing what they believed. I kept my response short. I stated that no one should rely on a capitalization document bearing my signature without direct confirmation from me. Martin interrupted to say the document was merely illustrative. I asked why an illustrative document required a signature. He did not answer. Camille ended the meeting and placed me on paid administrative leave pending a wellness review. The announcement reached employees before I returned to my office. My badge stopped opening internal doors. Security supervised while I collected a coat, a framed photograph of the original team, and the mechanical keyboard I had owned before Threadline existed. I left the building I had chosen, leased, furnished, and filled with people, carrying my belongings in a cardboard box printed with our logo. That night, Mom came to my apartment. She had heard Camille's version first. According to that version, I had panicked during a normal financing process and threatened the company's future because I could not accept sharing control. Mom asked me to pause the lawyers and settle the disagreement privately. She said my sister had always needed public success more than I did. I asked why Camille's need created my duty to disappear. Mom did not have an answer that could survive being spoken aloud. She cried instead. For most of my life, her tears had been the signal that I should become easier. This time, I gave her copies of the forged consent and asked her to read them before defending anyone. She left without taking the papers. I placed them on the table where she had been sitting and finally understood that evidence could not help a person committed to comfort. The Halcyon presentation was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was designed as the final management session before the investors submitted terms. Camille planned to combine the pitch with a customer showcase, turning confidential diligence into a performance that would make withdrawal embarrassing. More than 200 employees, clients, local business leaders, and reporters had been invited. My administrative leave should have kept me away. Daniel changed that. The independent committee had interviewed customers and employees, secured copies of the data room, and asked the investor group to delay any decision. The lead investor, Adrian Cole, requested that I attend the presentation without being announced. His firm had found inconsistencies and wanted to observe how Camille handled questions she had not rehearsed. Naomi worried that the event was theatrical. Daniel argued that the false story had become part of the transaction and needed to be tested in the same room where it was being sold. I agreed to attend on the condition that the investors received the authentic ownership and intellectual property records beforehand. Camille's office issued my temporary badge as operations support. I suspected she intended the label to humiliate me if anyone noticed. Instead, it allowed me to stand near the back without becoming the story before the evidence was ready. The ballroom looked like a monument to a company I barely recognized. Screens displayed our milestones beside photographs that centered Camille. A glass case held the first server, though the card beneath it said Camille had purchased it with her savings. The folding table appeared beneath a spotlight. My fingerprints were probably still beneath its chipped varnish, but the exhibit called it the desk where Camille wrote Threadline's original code. Camille entered to applause. She was extraordinary on stage. That was always part of the tragedy. She could have been an exceptional commercial leader without stealing anything. She spoke about small businesses being invisible to conventional software. She described our mission with warmth and precision. She told the story of Bennett Carton's duplicate invoices, replacing my late nights with her sudden insight. Then she explained that she had designed Threadline to preserve the human judgment inside every operation. I watched her claim my grandmother's lesson. The presentation moved into product strategy. Camille demonstrated a clean version of the dashboard and described features she had seen hundreds of times. Martin presented the altered growth numbers. A video showed customers praising Threadline, though the editing removed the moments when several of them mentioned me. By the time Adrian Cole approached the microphone, the room had been given a complete, convincing history in which I was unnecessary. He began with ordinary questions. Camille answered market size, expansion strategy, and pricing with practiced confidence. A second investor asked about retention. Martin supplied a carefully selected percentage. Then Adrian said his technical team had noticed repeated references in system logs to something called the June Protocol. He asked Camille to explain exactly what would happen if it were activated during a high-value payment. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but a ballroom can become very large inside a few seconds. Camille said it was an internal escalation workflow. Adrian asked whether an administrator could override it. She said senior administrators retained control because customers needed flexibility. He asked where the override record was stored. Camille looked toward our head of engineering, but Ravi was seated beside Daniel and did not move. She answered that the record remained in the primary audit log. Every part of her answer was wrong. The June Protocol was specifically designed so no senior administrator could complete an irreversible action alone. Its sealed ledger lived outside the primary environment. The separation protected the evidence if an administrator account was compromised. Camille had presented herself as the architect of Threadline, yet she did not understand the safeguard that expressed the principle she had just attributed to herself. Adrian asked why the feature was named June. Camille guessed that it referred to the month when the first version launched. Someone near the front inhaled sharply. It may have been my mother. Adrian turned toward the back of the room and asked whether I would answer. Walking from the service doors to the stage took less than a minute. It felt like crossing the entire history of the company. Employees turned in their chairs. Customers recognized me. Camille stood perfectly still, holding the remote she had used to advance through my erased life. I explained that June Bennett was my grandmother. I described her rule about machines and mistakes, the two-role approval requirement, the external sealed ledger, and the events that had convinced me to build it. I did not make a speech about betrayal. I answered the question as the person who had designed the system. Adrian then asked me to explain the first commercial use of Threadline. I told him about Bennett Carton's supplier invoices, the bakery, the machine shop, and the cold storage operator. He asked how much of the original code I had written. I answered truthfully, nearly all of the first version, with Ravi rewriting major sections as the platform grew. He asked when Camille joined. I gave the date reflected in her employment agreement. The 40-foot screen changed behind us. Daniel had authorized the investors to display a diligence timeline. It showed incorporation records, code commits, patent filings, early contracts, and board documents. My name repeated across every column. Camille's appeared 14 months after incorporation. Then the screen displayed two capitalization tables side by side, the approved ledger and the version uploaded for investors. The forged signature was enlarged between them. The ballroom did not erupt. Real shock is quieter than television suggests. People stopped moving because movement might imply allegiance. Martin left his place near the stage and headed toward a side door, where two members of the audit committee's outside legal team intercepted him. They could not arrest him, but they could instruct him not to remove company property. He placed his phone on a nearby table. Camille recovered enough to claim the difference was part of an unfinished restructuring. Adrian asked why the unfinished version identified her as controlling shareholder. She said lawyers had prepared alternatives. Daniel stated that company counsel had no record of drafting that document. Then Tessa rose from the second row. She had spent the previous week helping the independent investigators reconcile customer data. The reported retention number included 19 customers that had canceled or entered formal disputes. Several had been counted twice after changing billing entities. 3 large contracts shown as signed existed only as letters of intent. The financing valuation depended on revenue that Threadline did not yet have. Camille looked at me and accused me of organizing an ambush. I told her the questions belonged to the investors and the records belonged to the company. The only part that belonged to me was the name she had removed. Adrian closed his notebook. His firm would not issue a term sheet while the governance and financial representations remained unresolved. The other investors agreed. Camille's grand event had been designed to make retreat socially difficult, but no amount of lighting could make forged ownership safe. Daniel announced that the board would meet immediately in a private conference room. The customer showcase ended. Employees were asked to return to the office or work from home while the audit continued. Reporters received a statement saying Threadline had postponed financing due to an internal governance review. Camille followed me into a corridor before the board meeting. For the first time that day, no audience stood between us. She said I had destroyed our chance to become a billion-dollar company. I reminded her that the investors had arrived ready to fund the company I actually built. What stopped them was the company she invented on paper. She insisted that she had done everything to keep control inside the family. Her plan, as it emerged in fragments, was to complete the recapitalization at closing, use the new investment to cover weak results, and repair the records later. She believed growth would make the deception irrelevant. Martin had convinced her that founder disputes frightened investors and that a decisive chief executive could simplify the structure before anyone examined it closely. I asked whether she ever planned to restore my shares. She did not answer. The board meeting lasted 7 hours. Camille and Martin were suspended. Their access was revoked under supervision, and an interim finance officer secured the banking systems. I was reinstated, but I declined the board's request to become acting chief executive immediately. I would not accept control until the independent investigation established the company's real financial position. Daniel became temporary executive chair. Ravi took responsibility for product continuity. Tessa led customer communications. At 2 a.m, I returned to my old office. The cardboard box was still in my car, and the room had already been reassigned to a fundraising strategy team. I sat on the floor beside the window and read messages from employees. Some apologized for believing I had taken medical leave. Some admitted they had known the founder story was false but assumed I had approved it. A few asked whether they would still have jobs. That last question mattered more than the apologies. Revenge stories often end when the liar is exposed. Businesses do not. Payroll was due in 9 days. The delayed financing created a cash shortage. Customers had seen their confidential information used in a public event. Employees were frightened, and competitors were already calling them. Proving that Threadline belonged to me did not automatically make Threadline safe. The audit found enough cash to operate for 4 months if we froze expansion, canceled the new headquarters lease, and reduced executive spending. It also found that Martin had negotiated side letters promising discounts and services our pricing models did not support. Camille had approved them to inflate contract values before fundraising. We contacted every affected customer, disclosed the review, and offered corrected agreements. Several left. Most stayed. They stayed partly because Threadline worked, and partly because the people who had implemented it told them the truth. I joined customer calls from morning until night. I apologized without blaming my sister. I explained what we knew, what we were verifying, and what controls would change. When someone asked whether their data had been compromised, I answered with evidence, not reassurance. The June protocol became the model for our recovery. No executive could alter revenue status, capitalization data, or customer commitments without independent approval and a sealed record. We had built safeguards for our customers' operations while allowing our own company to depend on trust and family habit. I corrected that hypocrisy. The investigation eventually traced the forged consent to Martin's administrative account, but drafts on Camille's laptop showed that she had requested the ownership percentages and approved the final layout. Messages between them were painfully ordinary. There was no dramatic conspiracy language. They discussed making the founder structure legible, neutralizing Leah's veto, and cleaning legacy equity. Theft had been translated into management vocabulary until it sounded like efficiency. They also planned a secondary sale at the financing close. Camille would have sold $8 million of her newly allocated shares. Martin would have sold $2 million. My forged approval was the bridge between fiction and cash. The board terminated both of them for cause. Company counsel referred the forged documents and financial representations to federal and state authorities. Our insurers, lenders, and prospective investors received corrected disclosures. Naomi filed an action to confirm the approved capitalization and prevent any use of the fraudulent version. The court granted an injunction within days. Camille hired a public relations consultant before she hired a litigation attorney. Anonymous sources told reporters that a jealous technical sister had exploited minor paperwork errors to seize control from the visionary who made the company successful. The story might have worked if the records had been less complete. Instead, early customers volunteered contracts, emails, and photographs. Former employees described my work. Patent records and corporate filings required no interpretation. Mom finally read the forged consent after Daniel sent the audit summary to all shareholders. She came to my apartment again, carrying the papers in a folder as if their weight had changed. She admitted that she had known Camille exaggerated, but she thought exaggeration was the cost of selling. She had not imagined Camille would take my ownership. I told her that taking credit had always been practice for taking ownership. Mom asked whether I could keep Camille out of prison. I explained that I did not control the investigators, prosecutors, lenders, insurers, or shareholders she had deceived. Mom said family should not destroy family. I answered that accountability was not destruction, and silence was not love. For once, she stayed after I said something difficult. She apologized for training me to absorb every consequence because I seemed strong enough to survive it. The apology did not repair the years behind us, but it was the first time she named the pattern without asking me to continue it. The prospective investment disappeared, as it should have. Adrian Cole told the board his firm might reconsider after audited financials and stable governance, but he offered no promise. I appreciated that. Threadline no longer needed promises shaped like rescue. We cut expenses, slowed hiring, and asked senior leaders to accept temporary salary reductions before touching junior roles. I reduced my own salary to $1 for 6 months and canceled an executive retention package Camille had approved for herself. We sold unused office furniture, subleased a floor, and postponed international expansion. None of those choices were glamorous enough for a ballroom screen. Together, they gave us time. Ravi became Chief Technology Officer, the title he had long deserved. Tessa became Chief Customer Officer. We promoted a controller who had raised concerns about Martin's classifications and been excluded from fundraising meetings. Our new board included a customer representative and an expert in founder governance disputes. I accepted the chief executive role only after the corrected shareholder vote. My first company-wide meeting as CEO took place in the cafeteria. There was no stage. I showed the real numbers, including the lost contracts and legal costs. I explained which jobs were safe, which plans were paused, and how employees could report concerns outside the management chain. Then, I restored the original company timeline to our website. Camille remained on it. I did not erase her contribution because she had tried to erase mine. The timeline said she joined in year 2, built our commercial organization, and served as chief executive until her termination following a governance investigation. Truth did not need editing to make me look better. The harder correction happened inside the company. Camille had not created her version of history alone. She had created incentives for everyone around her to repeat it. Recruiters told candidates that they would work for a legendary founder. Managers learned that proposals moved faster when they credited her instincts. Employees who mentioned my early role were gently advised to focus on the future. None of those acts looked serious by itself. Together, they built an environment in which a forged cap table felt like the last step of an accepted story rather than a sudden crime. We hired an outside firm to conduct listening sessions without senior managers present. I expected complaints about Camille. I heard just as many about me. Employees said I had been accessible about product problems, but almost invisible during cultural ones. They had watched inaccurate biographies circulate and assumed my silence meant approval. They saw me accept a smaller title and concluded titles did not matter, even as their own titles determined pay and influence. Some had tried to warn me that Camille was consolidating power. I thanked them, returned to work, and treated endurance as leadership. That criticism hurt because it was accurate. I had confused refusing attention with practicing humility. The distinction mattered. Humility left room for other people's work. Disappearing left an empty space that the most aggressive person could occupy. By refusing to defend the truth while the stakes seemed merely personal, I had allowed the false version to become company infrastructure. I could hold Camille responsible for exploiting that weakness without pretending I had no responsibility to repair it. We rewrote promotion criteria so credit had to follow documented contribution. Major product decisions named the people who researched, designed, tested, and implemented them. Sales announcements recognized implementation and support teams alongside the person who signed the contract. Board materials included dissenting views, rather than presenting every decision as unanimous after the fact. None of those rules guaranteed honesty, but they made erasure harder. The first real test came when a customer discovered a reporting defect that had overstated inventory accuracy for 3 months. The old culture would have minimized the defect until engineering had a fix. The new process required immediate disclosure and a sealed incident record. Announcing it cost us a renewal and produced an ugly week of press. It also allowed 6 other customers to correct purchasing decisions before they lost money. At the following board meeting, nobody called the disclosure a failure of messaging. We called it the cost of becoming the company we had always claimed to be. Mom attended that meeting as a shareholder, but no longer as a board observer. She had resigned voluntarily after acknowledging that she had allowed family loyalty to distort governance. Her decision surprised me. It was the first consequence she had chosen for herself, rather than one imposed by a court or committee. She began meeting with a counselor and stopped carrying messages between Camille and me. When relatives asked her to make us reconcile for holidays, she told them reconciliation was not an event she could schedule. Our first Thanksgiving after the halcyon was small. Camille was under court restrictions and did not attend. Mom did not arrange an empty chair or make a speech about forgiveness. She asked me about cash flow, listened to the answer, and did not redirect the conversation toward my sister. The absence was painful, but it was honest. I preferred an honest, empty chair to another celebration built around pretending nothing had happened. I struggled more than I expected after the immediate crisis passed. During the investigation, anger gave every day a clear direction. Afterward, ordinary decisions became difficult. I checked access logs at midnight, reviewed harmless documents for hidden changes, and felt a jolt of fear whenever an executive requested authority. Naomi reminded me that governance could distribute risk, but it could not remove the need to trust anyone. I began therapy, partly because I did not want Camille's betrayal to turn caution into another form of control. Learning to delegate again was less dramatic than exposing a forgery, and more important to Threadline's survival. I gave Ravi authority to approve architecture changes without me. I let Tessa negotiate customer remedies within a defined budget. I stopped copying myself on every finance message. We kept independent checks, but checks were not the same as suspicion. A healthy system assumed that people could make decisions and that their decisions would remain visible. The company also created an ownership education program for every employee with equity. Martin had relied on people treating the cap table as mysterious territory reserved for lawyers and executives. We explained vesting, dilution, voting rights, option exercises, and the difference between an authorized change and a proposed one. People asked questions I wished I had asked when our first institutional directors joined. Complexity had protected the deception. Understanding became part of our internal security. 6 months later, Threadline returned to positive cash flow. A year later, we raised a smaller round at a lower valuation from a group that spent more time with customers than with our presentation. Adrian's firm participated, but it did not lead. His unexpected question at the halcyon became famous inside the company, though most employees misunderstood why he had asked it. During diligence, Adrian's technical team had seen June protocol entries in customer incident reports. When they asked Camille's team for documentation, Martin supplied a sanitized summary, but refused access to the architecture review. That refusal made them curious. Then, every engineer they interviewed credited me with protecting the feature from repeated attempts to weaken it. The investors did not know exactly what the answer should be. They knew the person claiming to have designed Threadline should. The question was not a trick. It was a test of whether the story and the substance belonged to the same person. Camille eventually pleaded guilty to one count related to the false electronic consent and settled the civil claims brought by the company and several shareholders. She avoided prison through cooperation, restitution, and home confinement, but she lost her shares under the cause provisions in her employment agreement and surrendered the proceeds of an earlier stock sale. Martin received a harsher sentence because investigators found similar conduct at a previous employer. For a long time, Camille communicated with me only through lawyers. Then a handwritten letter arrived. She did not ask forgiveness. She wrote that she had spent years believing the person who told the story owned the achievement. Every room rewarded her for that belief until she treated my silence as consent. She said the worst moment at the halcyon was not seeing the forged signature on the screen. It was hearing me explain June and realizing that she had repeated our grandmother's lesson without ever understanding it. I kept the letter but did not answer immediately. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be another service I performed on demand. 2 years after the presentation, Bennett Carton replaced its last spreadsheet with Threadline. Mom had resisted because the old processes reminded her of Dad. I spent a weekend at the plant helping her staff migrate records. In the laundry room, the folding table still stood beneath the pipe. The hotel had returned it after the investigation, and Mom had refused to throw it away. The crop marks from the exhibit label remained on one corner. I could see exactly where the photograph had cut me out. We moved the table to Threadline's headquarters and placed it in the lobby, but I rejected the museum-style display Camille had created. Instead, we mounted the full photograph above it. The image showed me at the computer, Ravi asleep in a chair, Tessa sorting handwritten implementation notes, Mom bringing coffee, and Camille standing in the doorway during one of her early visits. The caption listed every person and the year each joined. New employees sometimes ask why the table matters. I tell them it reminds us that companies are rarely created by the clean story presented on a stage. They are built through accumulated acts of attention. The bug someone stays late to fix, the customer someone calls back, the risk someone refuses to ignore, and the truth someone records when trust would be easier. I also tell them about the June Protocol, not the polished version from our security manual, but the reason it exists. Power should never be able to erase the record of its own actions. That principle saved customers long before it saved me. My sister took credit for the business I built because she believed credit was merely a story, and she was the better storyteller. She almost turned that story into legal control. What stopped her was not a dramatic confession or a clever act of revenge. It was the architecture beneath the performance. Ownership records, code history, customer memory, independent oversight, and one safeguard named after a woman who never trusted unchecked power. The investors asked what would happen if someone activated the June Protocol. The truthful answer was that the irreversible action would stop, the evidence would be sealed, and no single administrator could force the system forward. That was exactly what happened to Camille.